Hi, welcome to the next series of the critical systems in 1D4D5. Till now, we had been covering systems with 3 knight f3, and now we'll go to 3 knight c3, where white is not only exerting pressure on d5, but making the game more forcing than 3 knight f3. The advantage for white is obvious that the d5 pawn is under pressure and white is immediately starting to make threats. But there is a significant drawback that after bishop b4, this knight would be pinned. In this section, we'll be looking at the Gukesh QGD, which I am not sure is the right term. Probably it can be called accelerated Ragozin, but I haven't heard a good name for this particular system. And because Gukesh was playing this first, I decided to name it after him. I'm not saying he's the first person to play it, but the first top level player to play it consistently. What do we do here? So white is exerting pressure on the pawn on d5. We start by defending that pawn and developing a piece on the king side. We want to put our bishop on the most active square, that is b4. But we wait for a moment, because if we play bishop b4 here, white has a3, and after bishop into c3, b into c3, the key issue is that white might play f3 in some variations, trying to gain some space with e4, and transpose to one of the variations in Samish, in the Nimzo-Indian. I want to avoid that, and due to that, we start with knight f6. This is the starting point of the next several chapters. After knight f6, white has plenty of options, but the critical try is obviously c into d5, e into d5, and bishop g5. So let's try to talk about the strategic occurrences till move 5. Usually in QGD, this bishop is obstructed. It's now having a clean access to the diagonal or c8 h3, something in our favor. But white hasn't committed the knight on f1, which means in the typical QGD setups, the knight on f3 is not great, but the knight on e2 makes way for the pawn on f2 to jump to f3, thereby preparing e4, which means white has some added flexibility. This is white's advantage. Coming back, in this position, space is equal. The pawn structure is already kind of in white's favor because there is a target to attack to. But it's not a very big deal, and basically we can play the most ambitious bishop b4, putting the bishop on the most active square and pinning this knight. And after this, the position becomes very tricky. This is the start of Gukesh QGD, where we are playing and putting our pieces on the most active square, just like the Manhattan, but there are some important differences. Firstly, when comparing this to Manhattan, white hasn't committed knight f3. So which means white has the option of putting this knight on e2 somewhere in the future. But we haven't committed knight bd7 as well. So we might place our knight on c6 as well in some lines, or we might get our bishop out early on in the game. The second important strategically important element is that h6, g5, knight e4 is still possible, and so is the c5, queen a5 plan, exerting pressure on the c3 knight. And our philosophy remains the same. The moves change a bit, but the philosophy is still the same. We want to harass the bishop on g5, and we want to harass the knight on c3. In this chapter, we'll start with the absolute main line arising from e3, where white opens up the diagonal for this bishop and prepares bishop d3. We start harassing the bishop with h6. As we already know, h6 is a very useful move to have in these positions. And white plays bishop h4. We play g5 and start attacking the bishop. So g5 has brought a strategic change in the position. We have more space and we are exerting more threats. So our pieces would be very well placed, especially that after bishop g3, knight e4 is coming. But our pawn structure is a bit spoiled. What does that mean? What does that infer? That basically means is that if white is able to trade some pieces, white will stand better. We, on the other hand, have to exploit the active position of our pieces because we are structurally worse. The critical line here is knight ge2, where white puts the knight on e2 and not allows us to double the bishop, nor trap it with h5, h4. So with knight e4, we are threatening to play h5 and h4, trying to trap the bishop, since bishop e5 runs into f6. If white plays h3, we'll then play knight into g3 and spoil white's kingside pawn structure. So with knight ge2, what white is doing is defending both the weaknesses on g3 and on c3. What do? We keep gaining space and keep making threats and try to trap the bishop with h5. Note that now white has developed 3 pieces while we have developed only 2. So we have a very slight disadvantage in development, which is compensated by space and the active positioning of our pieces. The knight on e2 obstructs this bishop, so it is not easy for white to finish the development. Secondly, this king is stuck in the center. Our king can always be safe on g8. So that is an advantage in our favor too. Now there are 2 or 3 main lines in this position. The first one is clearly h4, the big main line, as we call it, of this chapter, the focus and interest of this chapter. But there is h3, which is quite important too. And then there is this queen c2. These are the 3 critical systems in the Gukesh QGD. In this chapter, we'll be covering knight g2, h5 and h4. White stops our plan of h4, and with h4, what white is trying to do is fix our pawn on h5 and open up the file for the rook on h1. Now the drawback is obviously that this pawn is weak and the bishop on g3 is a bit vulnerable. Secondly, the square on g4 is also weak. But white is also putting pressure on our pawns. h3 is a bit more considerate option, but it doesn't put pressure on our pawns. But white's pawn structure is a bit more stable too, and there are less threats. By the way, the most natural move here and what is played on most in the Leach's database is f3, trying to push our knight away. But this just weakens the pawn on e3, and that is a very big weakness because now it cannot be defended by a pawn. We firstly win the bishop pair with knight into g3, and white needs to play h into g3 to open up the file for this rook. If white plays knight into g3, we just gain space with h4, push the knight away, and after knight g2, white is threatening queen a4 check, forcing us to play knight c6. Knight c6, as we already know, is the ideal square for the knight, but if we have c5 included. If we don't have c5, then the knight on c6 might be a bit awkward. But here, we just play c6, prevent all ideas of queen a4, and now we want to play queen e7 and target the pawn on e3. The knight still restricts this bishop on f1. The pawn on e3 is weak, and black has the pair of bishops and more space. Everything, every single strategic element is in our favor. So black should be clearly better. Coming back to the main line with h4. Now this position, when I analyzed it, the move which I am going to recommend, bishop g4, was very fresh. Now it's been played, so that like at that point it was not very popular. I prepared this in September 22, but now some Indian players have played it. Even Fabiano played this against Richard Rappo in Weiganzi 2023, making this popular. Still, it's very fine objectively, and we should have no problems. The move from a strategic sense is the most ambitious. Why? Because we are exerting pressure on this diagonal, and we are threatening to spoil white's pawn structure with knight into g3. I tried a lot of things here, but other moves have some issues. Knight into g3, for example, was the main line. It's not the main line anymore because people started playing bishop g4, but it was the main line till some point. And after knight into g3, gh4, knight h5, queen g5, uh, queen g5, queen a4 check, knight c6, knight f4. This was supposed to be the main line. It feels that black should be fine because of the pair of bishops. But firstly, keep placing our king on a safe square is not really possible. Additionally, our pawn structure is very weak. The pawn on d5 is a loose end, and the knight on e4 is f4 is very strong. So because of that, we can't just challenge white's pieces easily. And yeah, white has a good stable advantage, mainly due to good positioning of pieces and our weak pawns. With bishop g4, we say that we are not making a permanent static weakness and we are playing on dynamics. Now white has few choices here. There is f3, which is much weaker but has been played by some players. There is queen a4 check. There is queen c2. And then there is the main line with queen b3. By the way, h into g5 is just not good because after knight c3, you are losing material due to the pin on g4 d1 diagonal. So let's start with queen a4 check. This is good. Queen a4 in general is a good inclusion for white in the QGD setups. But in this particular position, it's not good because the threat is bishop into e2 and knight c3. There is a very concrete threat which white cannot defend against. If white plays f3, we just get an inferior version of 11th move f3. And if you don't do that, I'm threatening to play knight into g3 and gh4, winning a pawn. Remember that you don't have knight into h5 any longer, just unlike the previous move, black is already slightly better. Queen c2 is another possibility too. White develops a piece and defends this knight on c3, but the issue, as usual, is that we can take and win the pawn. There is no knight h5, and after knight f5, trying to attack this pawn on h4, we start developing our initiative. We don't spend any time and bring our queen into the game with queen f6, knight into h4, and play knight c6. So let's try to evaluate this position. We have the pair of bishops. We are going to castle long, after which our king is going to be extremely safe. White probably has a slightly better pawn structure, but white has issues with the king. You can't castle long, nor can you castle short. And if you play f3, then this pawn would be weak. So white has some serious issues in the position. And main king safety, as we already know, is the paramount element in chess. Because white's king is not good, because we have the pair of bishops and our pieces are very actively placed, I don't see any problems for black in this position. Also, queen c2 is less ambitious than queen b3 because white is not making threats. Queen c2 is a defensive approach. Queen b3 is an aggressive and a defensive approach. So that should be the critical way for white. If white plays f3 here, as usual, we take, and come back. Now we have two weaknesses to attack to, h4 and e3. Our plan is going to be very simple. We want to castle on the queen side. And how do we achieve that? By developing our knight to c6, getting the queen out to e7, in some cases to g5, if white plays h into g5, and then castling long. This is also one of the important plans in the Manhattan system, where you play knight c6, get the queen out somewhere to either to e7 or to d7 or to d6 or to f6 and then castle long and try to exploit that white's king is still in the center. In this position, because white has played f3, it's even better for us since this pawn on e3 is weak. A good tactical line which you should be aware of is queen a4 check, knight c6, bishop b5. Now, we don't have to take this right now necessarily because we have an important tactical resource, bishop d7, and after bishop c6 to take on c3. The difference is b into c3, bishop into c6. We win the light square bishop, which why we didn't win here. And why is it super important? Here we don't win the bishop. Here we win the bishop with bishop d7, takes, then bishop c6. Why is it so important? Because white has several light square weaknesses. If possible, we want to play bishop b5 and just put our bishop on c4 square. This has a big weakness too, and so is this pawn. And that brings us an end to this 11th f3. Queen b3, the most critical response. White attacks our bishop and defends this knight. What do? Firstly, we win the bishop pair, knight into g3. The line with knight c6, which I have recommended as an informational in the course, is super interesting. We develop a piece, so it's very much principled, but there is a very concrete problem with it. White has bishop h2, and white wants to play f3, attack our pieces. We don't want to be passive, and if we try to be active with queen f6, which looks very, very good, the idea is to meet f3 with bishop f3, sacrificing the bishop for opening up the king. White survives barely after hg5. Gf3, queen f3 is winning for us, not an issue. H into g5, winning a pawn, since we can't take here due to gf3. The queen needs to keep an eye on the f3 square. Queen f5, gf3, queen f3. And rather than being passive here, white has the very strong long castle. The point is that after queen h1, computer's top choice is bishop c3, but after knight c3, knight into c3, bc3, queen h1, bishop f4, white has a very good position. After castle, queen c2, computer initially evaluates is as plus equals, but from a practical point of view, our king is super exposed. We are not really attacking this king, and these bishops looks very, very strong. Material wise, 1, 2, 3, 6, and we have a extra pawn as well, but our queen is trapped. The king's position is about to be opened with g6, and it's just super unpleasant to play this position as black. You can try this in one of your games as a surprise weapon, but I wouldn't advise you to rely on this particularly. From a practical viewpoint, this line is very, very dangerous. So we start by winning the bishop pair. White is forced to take back, and now we develop our knight. This is our typical plan. We want to play knight c6, get the queen out, castle long, put pressure on h4. These are the most important elements in this position. If you remember them, chances are you would very rarely fall into opening traps or an worse position as well right out of the opening. Now white has some choices here. There is bishop b5, which was one of the most ambitious moves, and this is what Richard Rappo played against Caruana. There is h into g5, which is not good as it allows us to bring our queen into the game. There is a3, and then there is knight e2, which was a novelty when this was written, but now there has been a couple of games with this move. So let's start with bishop b5, which is what Richard Rappo played, and Daniel Darda played it against Karthik Venkatraman, one of the strong Indian players. So with bishop b5, what is white threatening? To play bishop into c6 and win our bishop. We can play bishop d7, but it's very passive and leaves the pawn on d5 hanging. So we don't want to do that. We want to get a fresh piece into the game. How do we do that? We first start by bishop into c3. Since we don't have time to retain it, we either would have to play a passive move or just give up the bishop. In this case, we give up the bishop. White would play queen into c3, of course, because bc3 is unnecessary. You don't want to spoil your pawn structure if it's not necessary and doesn't bring a specific advantage. With bc3, white basically creates weak pawns for no reason. We just play gh4, win the pawn, and after knight e2, because white is threatening to play knight f4 and attack our pawn, we just play queen g5 and prepare long castle. We couldn't play queen d7 because of f3, bishop f5, and e4, and there are some concrete problems with d4, d5. And we couldn't place the queen anywhere else because the d5 pawn is hanging. With queen g5, we keep an eye on this pawn, we keep an eye on this pawn, and we prepare long castle. Now white needs to play knight f4. It is very tempting to try something like bishop c6 and queen b7, thinking that, okay, let's talk about this first, thinking that why black's king, if it castles, black's pawn structure is very weak and you can't castle long. But the king is super safe, guarded by these pawns. And after king d7, it's black who is winning because the rook is penetrating through the b file. And then there is a very obvious weakness on g2 to attack to. This king cannot be harmed, while after bishop g2 and queen g2, the king on e1 can be harmed. In general, it's good to discuss this position. Usually these positions aren't good. Why in this particular case it works is because firstly, the knight is on e2, which is a horrible square for knight in this position. The knight wants to be on d3, through which it can access the squares on e5 and c5. If white plays knight f4 here, we always have bishop f5 guarding those squares. Remember that you are a pawn up. So we have an extra pawn, and if we are able to develop, get our king out of harm's way, connect the rooks, we'll be better. And because of that, black is better. Queen b7 isn't good because as we have seen, king d7, the king is super safe, guarded by these pawns, and white has no way to continue the attack. White needed a light square bishop in this position, which is not there. Because of that, we have no issues to face. So white's critical move is knight f4, and we still long castle. Sorry, we castle long. Now white has some attractive looking choices. There is rook b1, getting a piece to the open file and trying to attack. There is bishop c6, and there is queen a4. Let's start with rook b1. White is trying to create threats with bishop c6 and queen b7. How do we meet this? By playing bishop f5. We open our eye for the g2 pawn and create the threat of bishop into b1. White's best bet is bishop rook b2. I mean, you can't play bishop into c6 because b into c6, and as usual, the king is very safe on d7. Bishop d3 is computer's top choice, but this releases pressure from the knight. So after b6, we have no problems. Our knight is now looking to jump to a5, where we will try to occupy the c4 square with the knight after bishop d3, knight d3, knight c4. And then the pawn on g2 is weak, the white's king is in center. We would try to open up the position either with rook e8 and knight e3 sack, or with h3 and just trying to get all of our pieces right into the action, attacking white's king. Our king now is very safe since white can't open up the queen side. So rook b1, bishop f5, and if white plays rook b2, now we get knight e7. The point is, we could have played knight e7 earlier, but the bishop on f5 is stronger. So we tempted white to spend some time. And if white plays something like bishop back, we now have b6. And if white plays queen a4, we just play king b8. And we are not afraid of bishop a6, since after b6, there is no way to open up the position and we remain a pawn up. White's king is now very bad, and in fact, we are looking to take over with rook d6, knight g6, and then targeting this pawn on g2. There is nothing to be afraid of. We play rook d6 to cover the c6 square so that queen c6 is not a threat, and then get our knight to g6. So rook b1 isn't great either. And if white plays queen a4, we just play rook h6, just like in the main line. Try looking to recapture with the rook now. And bishop c6 is not good because after rook c6, queen a7, we have plenty of choices. In fact, even okay, this is not possible because of rook b1, but rook a6, queen c5, and h3, looking to counter attack after gf3, bishop f3 is very strong. White has to play rook f1, and this king can't castle anymore. This king is very safe. This king isn't. The rook is on an open file, targeting a weakness. The queen is very well placed. We might now start looking to play rook f6 and try to open up the position and checkmate this king. So queen a4 isn't super impressive either, which brings us to bishop into c6, bc6, And now white has a better version of the earlier lines, but it's still not enough. White has now some interesting choices. There is queen a4 and there is knight d3. All of them aimed at attacking these pieces. Let's start with knight d3. The most logical. White is trying to reroute the knight into the attack. But after rook d8, not rook h e8, because we are making an escape square for our king, we are already winning. No, we have constantly, you need to keep on reminding yourself that white's king is in the center and that king can be attacked too. We counter attack, right? Remember, when somebody is trying to attack you, in chess, you attack back. In life, maybe you self-preservation is important. In chess, you will get the same set of pieces again in the next game. So rather than just saving yourself, your goal is to destroy your enemy. Rook e8, and black is already winning. The threat is rook e3, f e3, queen e3 with a checkmate to follow. And if white plays king d2 to defend the pawn, we have bishop f5, preparing bishop d3 and queen g2. Knight c5 looks interesting, trying to create some threats. And now queen g2 allows white to escape with a perpetual, but rook e3 just crushes the game. Queen b7 check, king d8 doesn't help white, as after check, king e7, there is a discovery with a rook somewhere to here and winning this rook since the king has to go back. And if f e3, queen g2 will win the h1 rook and slowly the game. The queen would land down to h2. Let's say after king c1 takes king b2, the queen comes here, defends c7, so we can very comfortably get the king out of harm's way. Remember that queen b8 can also be met with bishop c8, getting the bishop right into the defense. So the main king d2 doesn't defend. Knight c5, as we already know, doesn't work due to rook into e3 check. F e3 allows us to give a cute mate, king f1, bishop e2, king f3, e1, bishop f3, followed by queen e2 check and a mate. While knight e5, trying to block the knight is also not good. We just play f6, force the knight to move away, and then take on e3 with a completely winning position. And because of that, knight d3 doesn't work. Queen a4, on the other hand, is a bit more testing. The knight on f4 is strong because it stops the queen from looking over to the e3 pawn. What do we do here? Do we defend this? No. We counter attack and bring our last piece into the game and make a threat of queen f4. White needs to play castle, and we now play rook d6, defend the pawn, but at the same time create the threat of rook f6. This position is objectively balanced, but in fact it's very, very dangerous for white. Our idea is very obvious, to play h3 and bishop f3. White's attack on the queen side is not so threatening. There is just one piece, the queen, and one piece cannot checkmate me. While I have so many pieces already on the king side and the rook's coming in too. So if we talk about from a practical viewpoint, I think black has very good chances to win here. And that brings us an end to this variation with b into c3. White probably needs to play queen into c3, which we comfortably meet with rook h6, getting a new piece into the game, and now defending c6 while threatening gh4. Our plan remains the same. We want to get the queen out and castle long. White now needs to play h into g5. f3 is the top computer choice, but looks a bit artificial. We just play bishop d7, close the pin, and e4. This is what Daniel Darda played against Karthik. Karthik played g into h4, won a pawn. Darda played queen e3 with the threat of queen h6 and e into d5. If the knight moves, we are just a pawn up. We are not afraid about it. Queen e3. And now we play rook g6, which seems like the best option. White has some ways to keep the balance, but basically we have enough counter-attacking resources, and our plan remains the same. We want to play queen e7 long castle, or we want to play rook into g2. Because white has played e4, our king on f8 now can be safe too, since this pawn is now weak. So let's say white plays ed5. This is bad because after knight e7, takes. We'll win this pawn. This pawn is loose, and the king has not a safe square. We also have a great outpost on ed5. We'll not just win a pawn, but occupy the outpost. So white probably needs to play knight into h5, and we can play the safe queen e7, threatening to castle long, as well as setting up the cheapo of queen b4. I don't think our opponent will fall into that, but if they fall, okay, thank you for the free point. And this is a very balanced position. We want to castle long. We want to put pressure on these pawns. How do we do that? By constantly making threats. Note that there are several lines where knight f4 is met with queen g5 using this pin. Alright, so that brings us an end to this segment line with f3. And if white plays h into g5, we just take back with the queen. And basically, as we have already discussed earlier in the course, we want our opponent to take so that our piece is improved. We didn't spend any time on queen g5, and we are going to castle long on the next move. This should be good for us. And black is already better. Richard tried queen c5 with the idea that long castle runs into bishop c6, rook c6, queen a7. It feels like white has some attack, but actually after h4, it's white whose king needs to be safe. Knight e2 is not good because we play bishop e2, king e2, and check, and white's king is busted. King f1, queen f5. We have this threat, and we are getting white barely runs away by sacrificing the queen somewhere, but that's not the point. The king is busted. And if white doesn't do this, we are just better due to safer king, more active pieces. We want to play h4 next. Fabiano played a6, but which kept some advantage, but white was able to parry away some important advantage of us by bishop e2, castle, takes, queen c2, threatening to play queen e2. And this is not so great. The typical queen c5 long castle would have been so good. As usual, the principle and guideline of initiative over material stands. White's king is so bad, we have finished our development, and so one pawn should not be a bother for us. And this kind of ends this line with bishop b5. a3 is not good because we just play bishop into c3. Queen c3 and gh4. We win a pawn, and we want to play queen g5 and long castle on the next move. If white plays h into g5, we already know that this helps us bring our queen out with a tempo, and we play queen into g5. If white plays bishop b5, we take, queen takes, white is threatening this, and we play the natural rook h6, transposing to Richard Rappo, Fabiano Caruana, which we have already seen. And that brings us an end to all these sidelines on the 13th move. So after knight c6, preparing queen d6 or queen e7, queen f6 and long castle, white needs to play knight e2, which is the most critical move and not a novelty anymore. White's idea is that after gh4, the knight would jump right to f4, winning this crucial central pawn. We can't afford that, and that's why we again sacrifice a pawn for initiative and play queen d6, preparing to castle long, not spending any time on g into h4. Look at this, that the queen is very much active on d6, and on d7 it would have been worse. Queen d7 is fine, but I always want to put my pieces on the most active squares. White's best try is h into g5, because after a3, bishop a5, white would still need to play h into g5 or long castle. Long castle is met comfortably with long castle, and we have the pair of bishops. We are threatening gh4, so white needs to play h into g5 and transpose to the main line. So after h into g5, we play long castle. We put our king on a very safe square. And let's look at the position again from a strategic viewpoint. We are a pawn down, but we have the pair of bishops, a much safer king, and much more active pieces. So how do we use that? By making threats and using the activity of our pieces. Our job is to keep harassing white. White's job is to consolidate. White's bishop on f1 is stuck and cannot be developed easily. That is one of white's biggest problem. So what white wants to do? Castle and somehow get the bishop out. If white is able to do that and get the knight out, get the bishop out, white should be better. We need to prevent that. a3. If white castles, which is very much possible, we play the rather surprising bishop a5. And the idea is we want to play knight b4 and bishop f5, threatening to play bishop c2. There is no good way for white to improve the position since this knight cannot move. g3 cannot be played because we have multiple choices, the simplest one being king b8, and still this bishop cannot move due to the threat of bishop into c3. So basically g3 just doesn't help. f3 is not good because you create an unnecessary weakness. And after bishop f5, knight f4, knight b4, we defend this pawn. The pawn on e3 is weak and we are threatening bishop c2. Black is already slightly better from a practical viewpoint. And so white needs to play a3, but this transfers to the main line, starting from a3, bishop a5, and now castling long. So now white has won a pawn. White's king is safe too. But the problem of these pieces are not solved. And this pawn is weak. So if we recover the pawn, we'll still be better due to the pair of bishops. White now wants to play f3, knight f4 and get the pieces out. So what do? We start by playing king b8, vacating the c8 square for a bishop. White has nothing good but to play f3. And now we get our bishop back to c8. Why didn't we want to put it on e6? Because it would have obstructed, after knight f4, it would have obstructed our rook's diagonal and we won't be able to attack the weakness on e3. Bishop c8. We get the bishop out and white plays knight f4, bringing the knight out, opening up the diagonal and targeting our weaknesses on h5 and d5. Do we play passively? No. We play knight e7 and our idea is to play knight f5, attack white's weakness rather than defending our own, and at the same time trying to open up the position with c5. The position, if it opens up, it would help us since we have the pair of bishops and the pair of bishops helps the side. The open position helps the side which has the pair of bishops. With knight e7, we are looking to play knight f5 and attack the pawn on e3. White now has 2-3 choices. There is bishop d3, there is knight h5, and there is rook into h5. If white develops the last piece with bishop d3, we play h4, get rid of our weakness, and fix this pawn on g5. We now want to play rook g8 or play knight f5 and attack one of these pawns, and basically we'll win one of them. And then we'll have a balanced position where we have the pair of bishops. White would have somewhat better pawn structure since e3 wouldn't be easy to attack and d5 is already under some pressure. But the position is very balanced and complicated. I would really fancy my chances to win as black here. Of course, you need to show good deal of accuracy, but white is no more in control, which white usually is when they start with d4 and play so good in the opening. If white takes with the knight, this puts this rook in a defensive role. We can play knight f5 as well, but I want to be more ambitious and play c5, threatening to play queen e6, where rook e1 is not possible due to c into d4. And the position is very unclear. This knight is pinned and the rook is not doing a great job. Well, white cannot finish development with bishop d3 due to c4, and bishop e2 is already lost due to knight f5 and knight into e3. White has alternatives here, but the position is very unclear. You want to attack these weaknesses with queen e6 or by playing cd4 or queen g6 or knight f5. What do you want? How should you approach this position? By looking to attack your opponent's weaknesses. And if white plays the last critical move, rook h5, we take, and now play queen e6, attacking this pawn. Knight a4. By the way, queen g6 wins a pawn too, but This is a double pawn, so I'm in no rush to win this pawn back. This pawn is guarding this pawn and this pawn, and basically if this pawn falls, we have the center control as well as a passed pawn in the center. So white needs to defend it. How? With knight a4. Now we get our knight into the game. Knight f5, again attacking the weakness. White will defend it with rook d3. But now the rook on d3 obstructs the bishop. And now we switch our plans and play queen g6. We'll win this pawn and then keep on attacking the pawn on e3. Black stands better due to the pair of bishops, the weaknesses in white's position, and the obvious moves you have in plan. What do you want to do? You want to win this pawn. Then you want to attack this bishop with knight g3 or play rook e8. Maybe get this bishop into the game with c6, bishop as c7 as well. Black's move are very natural, while white is struggling for moves here. That brings us an end to this main line with 10 h4. Basically, the idea, let's just go back and slowly go through the entire line again. Knight c3, knight f6, cd, ed, bishop g5. White is exerting pressure on us. We play bishop b4. We, just like the Manhattan, we exert the pressure on the knight. e3, h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, knight e4. We are getting our pieces to the most active squares. White's best bet is knight e2. h5, we are threatening to trap the bishop with h4 or win the bishop pair with knight g3. White's best idea is h4. f3 is weak, as after knight g3, this pawn on e3 is weak. We just want to play c6, queen e7 and start attacking this pawn. h4 and the super crucial bishop g4. We are threatening knight into g3. So white's critical try is queen b3. We take on g3 first. Important. We don't start with knight c6. We take and play knight c6. And the idea is to get our queen out, castle long. If white plays bishop b5, we play bishop c3, queen c3, rook h6, followed by getting the queen out and castling long. If white plays knight e2, now we play queen d6, sacrifice a pawn, so that after hg5, we castle long. White has a3, the most critical try. Even for long castle, we play bishop a5, threatening knight b4 and bishop f5. So white needs to play a3. And after a3, bishop a5, keeping the bishop pair, keeping the bishop on an active diagonal. Long castle, white wants to play f3, knight f4, get the bishop out. So we play king b8 and we have a complicated position in our hand. The important thing is to just keep attacking your opponent's weaknesses here and basically get all of your pieces right into the action. Alright, so this ends the first chapter on the Gukesh QGD. See you in the upcoming critical chapters.